I don't see him, but he can make himself known when he arrives. Um, Jolly good. Well, I think then I might crack on as we've got pretty high numbers. Um, Thank you everybody for coming and joining us. I'm very pleased to see such high numbers for such an early in the year webinar. I think everyone's kind of dusting all the rust off ourselves and getting ourselves going after the Groundhog Day Christmas that most of us have had. And so thank you for turning up and joining us. So I'm Sam Sinclair, one of the directors of Biodiversify, but I strongly suspect most of you know this. Robin Price, the director at Water Resources East, is going to be joining us and pitching in shortly. I'm going to do most of the talking, but then, as always, there's going to be a lot of Q&A, a lot of questions and answers. And so Robin will be, I'm sure, very keen to take some of those as they emerge. So we've done the projects bit, or we're still doing that, but we've done the majority of it. We're right now at the tail end of the objectives and actions stage of this process. The very sharp, pointy bit of that little arrow. And that's because we extended the deadline to basically close of business before Christmas on I think the 18th of December, and that's because we got a lot of interest and submissions kind of right towards the end of that. So we want to keep that window open as long as possible. We've now processed them all, or at least all the ones we got on time. And now what we're doing is presenting back to you the first draft of the objectives and actions list for this project. I have literally 15 minutes ago sent this to Nancy to upload on the website. So she'll put that on up on the website shortly after this webinar, and you'll be able to access that and peruse the data sets and the list to your heart's content. And then as of tomorrow morning, we're going to be starting on the target side of things. So this is kind of a brass tacks of how much natural capital are we going to need across Eastern England. And we'll be having a webinar on the 2nd of February to talk about that in more detail. So first off, I want to say thank you for your submissions. We've had a fantastic response from everybody. Loads of submissions from loads of people, and there's more to come and more coming in. So we're really excited about that. We've received an enormous amount of other forms of interest. So we've had emails and phone calls and all kinds of different documents sent to us and different kinds of questions and queries, which is really exciting and really fantastic just to see how enthusiastic and excited people are about this kind of thing. Thanks to those of you I often seem to get phoned when I'm holding my son. So a lot of people have spoken to me whilst he screams in the background. So thank you for the patience people have on that one. As always, this is going to be an ongoing process. So although we're talking about the objectives and actions that we've had submitted before Christmas, you haven't missed the boat. People can still submit actions and objectives. We'll deal with them in, well, probably March, I think will be when we'll reopen the kind of discussion on that front. So if you see this and you haven't submitted something, but it inspires you to, then please just send something over to us and we'll process it at the first opportunity. Right, so what I'm going to do now is talk through how we've dealt with the objectives you sent us. We've received inputs from over 30 different organisations. I have to say over 30 because there's a couple of slightly confusing things about the people we've received them from. Obviously, we'd like more, but this is, I think, a really solid foundation for now. And part of the reason I feel this is a very solid foundation is we have processed 473 objectives and 449 actions, which is massive. We felt that was a really, really broad swathe, representative scope of the things that people would like to see from or for nature across Eastern England. And the thing that kind of really excited me about this is that it reflects the complexity of the situation. Eastern England is a large area with a lot of different stakeholders, with a lot of different interests and a lot of different types of habitats and actions and management strategies. And I feel like the strength of this plan is going to be taking that complexity, dealing with it, front on and honestly and thoroughly, but then translating that into something that's simple to understand and that kind of helps guide action in a really pragmatic and easy way. So I'm very happy that that kind of complexity has been represented in the swathe of actions and objectives that have been submitted. To me, that's a kind of real strength of this process. So we've been busy, and by we, I actually don't mean me. I mean Cecil LaRossa and Julia Hayward, our two planners. Dr. Cecil LaRossa and Dr. Julia Hayward, pardon me, have been reviewing and adapting this massive long list of submissions and preparing them for use in the plan. We spoke a bit about how we have been doing this in the webinar we had on the 1st of December, which is available online if you've missed it. But I'm now going to go into a bit more detail because we've had to adapt our methods in a good way to deal with this, well, to be honest, deal with such a wide scope of complexity and breadth. We've tried to incorporate all the submissions, absolutely everything we could. There were a few late ones that got there. Basically, my planner said enough. We have to crack on with the targets. We have to close the door somewhere. So there are a few that we haven't processed, but they will be, like I said, they will be addressed in probably around February, March time. And just to give you a kind of quick reminder, this is the process that we highlighted on the 1st of December. People will send their submissions in. We will assess and adapt them where necessary. We will categorize them. We will then expand, support, and define these categories, and then we will continue to report on this. So we've done these front four here, the first four over the Christmas, well, either side of the Christmas period, and this webinar is me reporting on this as we make progress. So, like I said, this is an extremely broad range of actions and objectives submitted, which is really fantastic. Really glad to see that. And we've actually adapted our methods in order to make the most of this complexity, because we weren't quite sure what we were going to get. We weren't quite sure how wide a scope and a wider swathe of interests people would express. So we've updated our approach to reflect this. And I think this is something we mentioned very early on and throughout these webinars, is that this is absolutely an evolving, adaptive process. So the main way in which we've tweaked things is that instead of rewording your submissions, previously we discussed rewording them for inclusion in the analysis. Now what we've done is defined them. I'll talk more about this in just a second, but we've gone through and pulled out all the features of every person's submission so that we can include it properly and effectively in the analysis. We're also very keen for you to check that we've done this right. So probably within minutes at the end of this webinar, Nancy will put this draft list up onto the Water Resources East website, and we can send out to all the participants here as well. And you can go on there and check line by line your submission and everybody else's and make sure that we've processed it and assessed it correctly. We want this to be extremely transparent, so pretty much everything we've done is going up there on the website for you to critique and examine. So how have we defined your submissions? So these are some real life submissions from Water Resources members. And what I'm going to do is talk you through how we processed them. So on the left here, the first column, that indicates the stakeholder who submitted this objective. The next column, the objective, is their verbatim text. So specifically the words they used when they submitted the objective. And we've included this because I think it's really important to include absolutely honestly the words that were first submitted so that people can check that we've assessed them properly. So the first column after that then, the third column here, sorry, is the desired feature. So here we've identified what it is that we feel the stakeholder has identified as the kind of core component of this objective, which biodiversity feature they're interested in. So for example, the first one here, RSPB have said they want to restore fenland habitats. So clearly fenland habitats is the desired feature there. The second one talks about freshwater habitats in rivers, or freshwater habitats is the desired feature there. The next column, the fourth column, is what is the aspect of this feature that they're interested in. So the first two, the fen habitat and the freshwater habitats, they're interested in the quality of these habitats. RSPB have mentioned they want to restore fenland habitats. So we've said, okay, we think that's about the quality of fenland. But the Cam Valley Forum have said they want to increase the area of managed scrub. So what we've said is that that's about quantity, therefore. That's about increasing the area, so the quantity of managed scrub. The next column is the direction of change. So generally this is about growth. RSPB have said they want more fenland quality, so that's fenland habitats, that's improving. more high quality. But there are also quite a few people have identified the importance of maintaining what we already have. So there's an anonymous submission here where they've said they want to both maintain and increase peatlands for carbon storage. Now, this brings me to an interesting point, which is sometimes people will submit objectives that actually contain kind of two objectives in one. That's what's happened here. So they've submitted protect, maintain, and increase peatlands for carbon storage. And that what we've done to reflect this is split that into two rows so that we can have one that deals with maintaining peatlands, another one which deals with increasing. We've also identified any actions, whether they've specified them, and then we grouped them into natural capital categories. So this is what I meant when I said categorization. So these are categories shared by Natural England. So these aren't ones we've made up. And they are ways of loosely grouping people's submissions into broad categories, which helps us link the objectives to actions and to evidence bases. But I'll talk more about that in a second. And then the final column, which is potentially the most important one, is the data. So how are we going to represent the objective that the stakeholder has identified in the plan using data? And this is what we're currently going through at the moment, is working through where can we find evidence that will support, that will help us identify where this objective needs to take place across Eastern England. Across Eastern England in the plan. So the habitat network is going to be the answer to quite a few of these, but in some places we're still trying to find data, and we're also sourcing data from a range of different sources. One of the kind of important things to know is that we have to use data that's equally available across Eastern England. We have to have data that's representative for everywhere. So that's how we're summarizing the objectives in a way that we can use in the analysis. And this is a quick overview of the contributions we've had from people split into the different natural capital categories. So we've used three broad categories: biodiversity, ecosystem services, and ecological processes. Biodiversity is fairly simple, really. Habitat, species. Ecosystem services is the things people want from it. And then ecological processes are more about the kind of the broader characteristics you get from a well-managed network. So things like resilience, connectivity, that kind of thing. And I think what hopefully those of you who are quick readers have started to notice is that the submissions we've had have been broad, but there are some clear favorites. So habitats have been mentioned most frequently. 93 different objectives have come out that are related to habitats from 14 stakeholders. 21 objectives of climate regulation, so carbon mostly, from 11. Water quality and connectivity have also been highlighted as particularly important. And I think, again, this is interesting because it kind of shows us that there are a broad range of things people want from their landscapes, but that also habitat is central to this, and that is what we were kind of hoping to see, really, in a landscape level plan, that habitat would be kind of front and foremost about this, largely because habitats, we have a lot of data that represents habitat equally across the area, whereas species is much harder. So this table here, these categories, we developed these to help us understand, primarily just to get a grip on what it is people want. So when we represent the communal stakeholder view of the vision for natural capital in Eastern England, we can actually break this down to something that everyone can understand and we can express clearly. So it's partly about communication. It's also about linking the objectives to the actions. So we are going to be categorizing the actions as well, which I'll talk about in a second. But then thirdly, the reason for this is to identify where there is evidence that supports the connections between the actions and the objectives. So where are the peer-reviewed or otherwise, reports or any other publication that identify where, for example, restoring wetlands will contribute to climate regulation and water quality. And there's a large, slightly terrifying database that our planning team are putting together at the moment, which pulls out all the evidence that exists that we can find, best available evidence, for linking the actions to the objectives. And there'll be more on that at a later webinar, but that's just to kind of highlight the key purpose of producing these categories. So moving on to actions, we've received 449 actions, which again, we're feeling quite happy with. We feel that's quite a kind of broad and representative number. These have also been assigned to the natural capital categories using a very similar, well, basically the method identified on the 1st of December. We've tried very hard to incorporate all the submissions. However, quite a few of these we had to exclude. They're excluded for various reasons, mostly because either there wasn't sufficient data or because they weren't appropriate for representing in a regional plan. As an example of this, sometimes people would state things like encourage the use of electric cars, or encourage the reduction of household use of water and things like that, which are totally important things. We very much recognize the importance of those, but they're not necessarily things we can exclude in a regional plan like this. Now, one of the most important things to kind of understand when I'm talking about actions and objectives is that a single action can connect to multiple objectives, and a single objective can connect to multiple actions. And because you have these two lists connected in a kind of almost like a fishing net of different connections, that makes linking these things fairly complex. Just to illustrate this, so if we've got two actions here, planting trees and restoring wetlands, both of these actions contribute to the objective of increasing priority habitats, but only planting trees contributes to air quality. Conversely, restoring wetlands contributes to providing habitat for wading birds, but planting trees does not, or at least probably doesn't. And I'm raising this point so that we can see why it's not possible to have a single spreadsheet that links all the actions to the objectives, because the interactions between them are myriad and not something that actually can be done kind of through just a simple spreadsheet. So this brings me back to the categories. So we've categorized the actions as well into biodiversity and ecosystem service categories, natural capital categories. Now you'll notice we haven't got the ecological processes category here, and that's because ecological processes are things that emerge from a suite of actions. So you can't plant a tree to deliver landscape connectivity, but you can plant multiple trees and wetlands to increase habitat connectivity. That's something that has to come from kind of the overall combination of efforts. And again, we'll notice that biodiversity is by far and away the most frequently identified category of actions from 15 different stakeholders. But water quality, climate regulation, flood control, and water supply were also identified as very important categories of action. And this I find very encouraging, because obviously that means that 3 of the top 5 most important categories of action are about water, which I think highlights, it's possibly a product of the fact that this is part of a wider water resource management process, but also I think highlights the importance of managing nature and water together in a holistic way and not separating them out into 2 different processes. So again, the purpose of categorizing these is to help draw the links between actions and objectives, and also to help support the use of evidence and science to link them. Now, the categories are very much about the analysis, about how do we represent these things in the evidence and the kind of the science behind all this. But ultimately, we're going to have to translate this into a plan that's easily understandable. And whilst those categories are lovely, they wouldn't be very helpful if demonstrated in a map, because there's just purely too many of them and they're too complex. So to translate this, all of these nuts and bolts, into something that's actually usable and practical and gets, moves towards action, which after all is the point of all this, what we have done is group the actions into zones. So these are zones that will be represented on the final maps. We've identified 4 main zones which have emerged organically from your submissions. The first is conserve, so conserve existing habitat for biodiversity and natural capital. And this is in recognition of the fact there's already a considerable estate across Eastern England that's really important, and this needs to be maintained. The second zone is establish new habitats. So this would be planting trees, restoring wetlands, that kind of thing, in areas where they're currently not being managed natural capital. So this is often farmland largely. The third category is restore. So restore existing habitat where it exists, but it is not in as good a state as it could be. So where you have degraded habitat, and this was probably the most frequently mentioned one in this zone would be peatland. So a lot of people talking about re-wetting peatland, restoring peatland, that kind of thing. And then the last zone is manage. So manage other non-natural capital land in a natural capital friendly manner. So a lot of this is agri-environment schemes, really. This is about supporting farmers to reduce pesticide runoff, that kind of thing, put in buffer strips. And the thing that's really key here is that we've always, noted that this plan will identify priority parishes for different types of action. And these are the zones that priority parishes will be assigned to. So where we've identified a parish as important, it will be associated with one or more of these zones. So, you might get a parish identified as having existing habitat that's really important. So it might be included in the conserve zone. But then there also might be opportunities for establishing new habitat to increase connectivity and flood prevention. So you might end up with a parish that's in both the conserve and established zone. And the purpose of this is to help translate all the complexity of this evidence and these objectives into something that's actually practical. So you can use this to then guide the development of local plans or local action to a certain extent, because these zones will be closely linked to specific actions. They also give us an indication of the kind of thing people want from their landscape. So here on the right is a little table of the number of actions that fell into each of these zones. And I think what you'll notice straight away is that really people have established on their mind. People are really keen on seeing new habitats established, new natural capital areas established across Eastern England. Restore also came up as very popular. I think a lot of that is about the peatland. I can't even tell you how many times peatland and wetlands were mentioned in the both the objective and the actions, and I think that's really important. And manage and conserve also, of course, identified as important. And the reason I share this particular table, I'll go on in the next slide, is pulling this out and talking about it in more detail, is I think it's really important to summarize these things to try and communicate and express what it is people want from the Eastern England's landscapes. And I think it's a really notable thing that people are going, actually, what we want is more. We want to establish new areas of natural capital. And I think that's really important to capture. So breaking this down a bit more, I've highlighted a couple. You'll notice that what I've done here is put the 5 most popular natural capital categories across the top and identified where they fall into the different zones as defined by the actions that people have submitted. And straight away, I hope you'll see on the far left column that the most popular one is establishing new natural capital areas for biodiversity, followed by restoring natural capital areas for biodiversity. But then in a sort of fairly broad tie, you've got establishing natural capital areas for flood control and water quality, and managing production landscapes for water quality as being identified as sort of joint third. And I think this is really interesting because this again tells us the types of activities that people are interested in undertaking across Eastern England. And I won't dwell on this too long, but this is basically just to sort of show how the analysis and all the kind of complexity is going to feed into these zones that will be expressed in the map. I also want to give you a brief overview of how these things come together to give the final plan. This is somewhat simplistic, but we'll be producing kind of more detailed things a bit further on down the line, especially when we come to the actions, the target stage. So on the left here, I've got kind of just objectives 1 and 2 and actions 1 and 2, which are representative of these larger lists. The objectives, one of their main contributions at this stage is identifying the data layers, as I noted from that table. So the table defines them and then indicates how they'll be represented in the plan. The actions come together and their main contribution is defining these zones. So where are these zones that will be represented on the map? And these things will be brought together through the spatial prioritization analysis to identify, to basically produce the landscape level plan for natural capital. We'll go into more detail about this at a later stage, but this is kind of just to give you a structure to hang this all off of how these things will come together. So there are a few exclusions I want to mention at this point. The most notable is species. So there's a lot of fantastic species data, but there isn't really generally reliable species data for the whole of Eastern England, which means we've had to exclude it. Now, that's not said it's excluded completely, because obviously a lot of the habitats that species depend on are being represented in the plan, and we can use the species data to inform that, to make sure that we're getting the right spots. There was also a lot of non-nature focused objectives. So like I said, people were talking about the need for, I think one company indicated that they were going to use only electric vehicles in their fleet. Now, obviously, that's a really fantastic sustainability initiative, but that's not really something we can include in a spatial plan. All of these things are listed on the spreadsheet that's going to go up on the website at the end of this webinar. So if there's anything in there that's being excluded that shouldn't, very easy for you to come in and tell us. Water actions and objectives were also included wherever possible, but obviously this is also the focus of the other water resources planning processes. So if you feel we haven't essentially we've captured all the water things that we can spatially, but all this is going to go feed into the main WRE planning process as well, which means that water aspects will be addressed in that work stream. There are also locally specific submissions, which are really important things, but we've generalized them for this regional plan. But this can be raised again when the first iteration of the plan is shared. So if someone said we're particularly interested in restoring wetlands in this area, this catchment or valley, and then when the analysis comes out, that's not identified as a priority. If that isn't, you could begin a discussion, or ideally it just would be, because the data would support your suggestion, in which case, fantastic. So I'm going to conclude quickly, and then we'll open questions. My experience has told me there'll be probably quite a lot. So we processed 473 objectives, 449 actions from over 30 stakeholders. Obviously, we're keen to get as many as possible, but this is I'm very happy with this as a solid foundation for the plan. All of this is going to be available on the WRE website by the end of the day. We've included this in both simplified and detailed formats. So all the tables, all the everything I've shared on this slideshow will be there, but then also the actual line by line analysis of every single submission's on there. And then, critically, really, we'd like your feedback. So please do have a flick through and check that your submission's been assessed in the way you'd want it to. If you haven't submitted something, please do. Very keen to hear that. And let us know what you think, really. Like I said, on the 2nd of February, we'll be having another webinar to discuss targets, and then we'll go into a lot more detail about that. The purpose of this webinar really is just to kind of share how we processed your work, your submissions. So that's covers majority of what I want to say for the day. I think probably now what we'll do is move on to questions. So please pitch them into the chat if you have any. I'm just going to load it up now. Has Robin joined us, Nancy?
He has indeed, yes.
Jolly good. Welcome, Robin.
Do you want me to bring him in?
Please give him the floor. While you're doing that, I'll answer a question from Kate DeVries. So Kate has asked, why do you need data which is representative everywhere? It might be that one organization has collected extra data which represents best practice, and the outcome might be we want to collect the equivalent data for all areas. So this is a really important point. And essentially it's because when we run the prioritization analysis, it'll identify where actions need to take place in order to deliver the objectives. And if you have one area where it's particularly well represented, where there's particularly good data, that will mean it'll be overrepresented in the data that goes into the analysis. So what would happen is we'd end up picking areas as priorities based on how good data collection was in that area. It's very difficult it basically has to be brought down to the lowest common denominator, which is a very frustrating answer, I appreciate, but that's why we can't do it. Basically, it has to be representative for the whole area. It's sometimes possible to stitch together data from different areas to produce a single good quality data set for the whole area, but that can be a massive challenge. And we actually have pretty fantastic data from Metro England that's regionally available. So we're going to start with that and see where we get to. If there are holes, we'll definitely come back and deal with them. The other thing that's important to note is that where there is locally available data, we can use that to verify the outputs of the analysis. So if we run something and it maybe misses out an important area for a species, and a local organization knows about this, they can use that to kind of go, well, actually, clearly you've missed out this area that's a priority. Actually, can we be included? And here is why. So that's another way we can incorporate it. Cameron Adams has asked, can you cut the data plan to particular boundaries, i.e. counties? Yes, absolutely. So one of the things I think is really important to note is that the purpose of this plan is to provide a regional strategy, but then that would always need to be interpreted locally. So counties will need to develop their own plans, for example, in the form of local nature recovery strategies or whatever else they want. So this analysis can be rerun at a local level, drawing on this regional input. So identifying how are you going to deliver these regionally important benefits at the local area. Helen Jacobs has asked, do you need target submissions from organizations before the 2nd of February? No, we don't. I'm sorry, I should have made that clear. What we're going to do is come back to you with really clear guidance on how to submit targets, partly because where objectives and actions we can be extremely open and kind of accept basically anything. With targets, we have to be more guided. Part of this is because there are ecological constraints. So I mean, part of this is it's difficult to get your head around. So if you ask me, how many hectares of woodland should we grow, and additionally in Eastern England, I'd struggle to put an accurate number on that. But also because there is an ecological limit to that. If you want to plant trees and riparian areas to reduce floods, well, there's going to be a limit to how many riparian areas there are that could receive new woodland. So we will be taking that form of information to identify bounds within which targets could be set, which we'll then present to you and talk you through in more detail in a second. Alan Woods has asked, do you have any visuals to remind us what the final product might look like, i.e. what we're working towards? Yes, we do. Would help with the reviewing the work. So we do. It's in some of the other webinars, so that should be all available online. I think it's also there's some PDF explainer documents up there which detail that, and they include knockups, dummy versions. I will double check that, but that should be all available on the Water Resources website. Stuart Smith has asked, it's great to see how it's progressing. Can you advise if and how public access to nature is being considered? Yes, I can. This is actually a topic close to my heart. So this is actually a really interesting topic. So we've been working with Professor Bob Smith, from DICE in Kent University, and he's been working with BBOUT, which is the Wildlife Trust in Buckinghamshire, Berkshire, and Oxfordshire. And they actually had this exact question come up. And what they found was they set targets for it, but that almost always the public access to nature targets were met in the delivery of the other targets. And that's partly because public access to nature is more about proximity. So identifying where nature can either be restored, managed, or established in a place that's accessible by different population areas. So what they found was they basically managed it for other things and then went back and checked whether it achieved public access to nature targets and found that it did. So what I think we're probably going to do is we will probably run the analysis, see if it will achieve those targets or start to set targets for those things. If it doesn't, we can then go back and revisit it. And because they're actually, I don't want to go into any details about this because I'm a social scientist, not a spatial planner. But there are ways of ensuring that nature is within certain distances of populations. Will the meeting be on the 2nd of February at 2? Yes, it will. The webinar is always going to be on 2 o'clock, largely because that's when my son's asleep. So it's most likely to avoid a lockdown interference. Paul Smith from Aquagrain, will there be a directory of the people representing water resources member stakeholders that can help submission and project collaboration? I would go through Water Resource Reefs for that. We've had to be quite careful about not breaking any rules or laws about sharing people's submissions. So what we've asked people is permission to share their submissions, but I'm not going to be sharing, I don't think we're going to be sharing email addresses, just membership organizations. I certainly have no intentions to. Water Resource East, however, would be able to help you with that. Can you provide, Alan Woods has asked, can you provide a way of cutting the data by Water Framework Directive water boundaries, or at least approximations of the water catchment boundaries to parishes within them? So maybe. I think you need to speak to our planning team about that. One of the kind of early decisions you make when using systematic conservation planning is identifying whether your planning units, which is the smallest pixel, would be whether you want that planning unit to be an administrative boundary, which is what we've chosen, like a parish, or a geographical boundary, like a water catchment. And this is a really important decision you make early on. And essentially it boils down to geographical boundaries are probably more accurate in terms of management. However, administrative boundaries are much easier from a project management perspective. So if your aim is to deliver targeted action, I go with water boundaries, for example. But if your aim is to coordinate large numbers of people across a large area, including many different stakeholders and populations, then better to pick administrative boundaries, which is why we pick parishes. So essentially, it'd be very easy to rerun this analysis for those different planning units. Probably the easiest way to do that would be through developing a local plan specific to your area. Sam Phillips has asked, are you or will you be looking at how you can overcome the limitations of using a spreadsheet to explore objectives with multiple benefits? We are, absolutely. So the spreadsheet is more about trying to communicate what it is we're doing. And that's partly because the actual kind of analysis is done in R. I won't even begin to pretend that I understand that. If you'd like a more complicated conversation, a more involved conversation about that, you absolutely can. Our planning team, like I said, Dr. Cecil Ross and Dr. Julia Hayward are working on that. And they're going into considerable detail behind this. Like I said, there's a very large document we're compiling of all the evidence that we can find that links actions to objectives, and then they need to those connections need to be represented in the analysis. It's not that complex analysis, and I hope that by the end of this we'll be able to explain it in a really transparent way. But the complexity is largely comes from the sheer number of actions and objectives we're dealing with. Ian Barker says, great response from stakeholders. Thank you very much, Ian. The bottom-up approach is valuable, but how does it reconcile the strategic overview of conservation, biodiversity, and water-related objectives and priorities across Eastern England, assuming that such a strategic plan exists? Well, Ian, it does not. This is going to be the first version, and then this, in fact, is the single largest natural capital planning project ever to have taken place in the UK, and I've had this confirmed by DEFRA. I checked with their team and they told me it was. So there isn't actually anything bigger than this that's going on. Wherever possible, we'll be linking the targets to, when talking about strategic overview, to national level guidances, targets, and other policies. Now, what we found is actually there's a lot less of that than you might expect. There's considerably less national level indication of how much we want of these different things from our country in terms of tree planting, carbon, etc., etc. Now, that said, there are bodies that have thought about this. So, for example, the climate change, the Committee for Climate Change, I'm slightly dyslexic. I'm almost certain, I know the acronym is CCC. They have developed a number of reports which give really good indications as to how much they think these different actions need to take place in order to deliver both climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. So we've drawn things from that. But again, we're populating a large database of every single target or number or strategy or whatever strategic level insight that we can find to inform strategies, to inform the targets, so that we really kind of make it clear how Eastern England will contribute our piece of the pie to the kind of national goals. From Nicholas, we've got a question. Is there a route already identified to get this plan embedded in the nature recovery networks to be developed by local authorities? Yes, and his point here is we don't want multiple competing or conflicting plans. So yes, there is. There is no single route. It's more about lots of separate conversations that we're having. One of the things that this process identified very early on was wherever there were potentially conflicting projects, and we've basically been having separate conversations with all the people involved in those to make sure that we're not going to be doing anything redundant. One of the things that's really important to note here is that we're working very consciously towards making this plan something that can support local plans and in no way overrule them or diminish them or undermine them. So from our point of view, this will identify regional priorities. Now, it may be that when you're developing a local plan, you identify local priorities, which can be a different set of things. But ideally, you'll also be interested in what your local area can do to deliver regionally important outcomes, which means you can look at the things that the plan suggests and go, oh, great, we can do some of that, which then will help you with fundraising or other resource management efforts. You'll be able to say, if we undertake this action here, we restore these wetlands, yes, it'll benefit, the Histon area, but actually it'll also provide a wider benefit to the whole of Eastern England, which makes it really important to support. In kind of parallel with this, we're actually working with DEFRA Natural England on some of the local nature recovery strategy trials, although I can't talk about that any further at this point. So we have got some oversight of how this is going to be linking up to these larger things. Tom Hansen has asked, is there going to be a financial value associated to the NCV? No, there will not. So I am not a huge fan of breaking down natural capital into pounds because I don't think that actually represents it as well as it can be represented. Rather, we're asking people to tell us what they want. And part of the reason for this is, pure clean water, for example, if you are in the desert, would have an enormously high value, whereas if you're in Wales in winter, would have a much lower value. And actually, it's more about how much of this stuff do you want? How much carbon storage, water purity, all that kind of stuff do you want? Raoul Chavin has asked, you mentioned about excluding habitats, but what about priority or migratory species? Please share your thoughts. So I think one of the key things here is if there are areas, and I know there are areas, which are of international significance for migratory species, then those can be included on that basis. So when we run this analysis, the output it's going to produce is very much the first cut. If we identify it and it misses all these stopover points of migratory geese, great, tell us, fantastic. What we'll do is include those areas as de facto priorities because they are considerably, they're very obviously important. We also might identify areas as important for social reasons. So for example, something that's come through quite a few times is that people are interested in restoring the fens in Eastern England, partly because of all the fantastic services they provide, but also because there is a cultural, a heritage aspect to this. People want to see fens restored to something that actually represents the kind of the history of this country and of this region. And that's something that, frankly, we're not going to try and represent in the data because that wouldn't be appropriate, but it is absolutely something we can include in the consultation. So when we produce this, this plan identifies what can happen where, if it comes back and it misses out bits of the fens that actually have a historical significance, or we can discuss including those as priorities for that reason, in which case the evidence that we'd use to support that might not be ecological, but rather social. And actually, I think as this is a project that's as much about the social aspects, so much about developing like a shared vision for what we want from Eastern England, as it is about ecosystem services and science, I think that's completely appropriate and actually is very much the strength of this. It seems Kevin Allen has said it seems that a relatively small number of stakeholders have created a large number of objectives and actions. It'd be interesting to see who's driving these and from what sector. Well, Kevin, I completely agree. Kelvin, my apologies. Please have a look on our website at the end of the hour when it's uploaded. You should have a look. We have really fantastic submissions, to be honest. And in a lot of cases, what we've done is draw on people's submissions from documents. So in some cases, what people have done is sent us their strategies. They've said, this is my ambition, or what we want to achieve, and we've drawn things from that. I mean, as an example, I actually went through one of Pippa Hayes, Councillor Pippa Hayes, who was the councillor for Histon, I believe. I went through one of her speeches and pulled out some of the things that she said and the people she represented, her constituents want from nature in Eastern England, and we include those because I think that's absolutely a clear indication of what political leaders and therefore the community she represents want. So in that case, it was the political process that was driving the contribution. So Alan Woods has said it's a great project. Wonder if you're getting independent peer review of your methods and outputs from natural capital experts would be helpful in selling the work to potentially skeptical audiences. Yeah, so that actually is something that's in the original proposal that we wrote way back when about this, and we actually have had early stages of this peer reviewed by international experts. So that is something that is definitely going to be considered. I think there's two levels to this. One is the peer review of the stakeholders who are in Eastern England, and that to me is I'm more concerned about and more focused on. And then there is a slightly more objective question of what international experts think of these approaches. And I mean, in fairness, we have drawn all of this from international best practice. So this is very much come from the massive peer review literature that exists on this topic. So it's already embedded in that, but that is absolutely something that's going to come up. Quite at what stage, I a little bit early to say. Probably after we've released the first plan, but before we've finalized the actual plan itself. Robin, are you there?
Robin is. I just need to ask him to unmute himself. 1 second.
Hi.
Muted. Afternoon. Yeah.
Afternoon. I'm just aware everyone has very, very patiently sat through 50 minutes of me talking, monologuing. So I thought it might be nice if you have anything else to say, just to break up the monotony slightly.
It's not monotonous at all, Sam. So yeah, happy new year, everybody. And yeah, so great to see almost 70 people on another SCP WRE call. So which is fantastic. Sam, I'm blown away. I'm seeing this for the first time. I don't get any sneak previews from you. I'm seeing this at the same time as everybody else. So I'm just reflecting at the moment. So give me half an hour just to let all this settle in before I comment on anything particularly sensible. I'm blown away by the number of objectives and blown away by the number of actions that you've got. I like the way you have processed it. You've shown it in a very simple way. It makes sense as well. It's really pleasing to see the ambition here, the ambition that's coming through from stakeholders. It's interesting to see that, I could say merely conserve and manage are your two lowest, the least favorite zones, whereas the most popular things are around restoration, establishment of new stuff, and restoration and creation, which I think is great. So to have evidence of that ambition coming through so clearly and so unequivocally feels right. Feels like the right answer. Feels like the sort of thing we'd have written down in an envelope before we started and shown you at the end. But good to have some data and have so much evidence behind that. I guess like many people on here, and I'm getting a sense of this from the questions. Everyone's excited. Well, what's next? That's been lovely, brilliant. Show us on the map. Get to the point, Dr. Sinclair, and show us what this all means and everything. And I think that's a credit to the work that's going on and everybody's input. We're all impatient to see the next stage and everything. Very excited by this. I didn't know this was the largest natural capital planning exercise that's going on at the moment, which is great. That's a fantastic set of questions. Great engagement. Yeah, and I'd like to thank you, Sam, and the team, but I'd really like to thank everybody on this call and all of the organisations who have contributed, and perhaps if there are one or two organisations on the call who weren't able to, hopefully this has given you today's webinar has given you a real insight into how Sam and the team are processing the data, and actually is coming up with a picture is slowly emerging. As I say, I just need a little bit longer just to let it all process and settle, being a bearer of very little brain here this afternoon. So give us all a moment to come on this. So thanks Sam, thank you everybody, and it'd be great to So what happens next? What's the rest of the program, Sam? What can we look forward to over the next month or two in terms of the webinar?
Yeah. So what's happening now is CISO and Julia, our planning team, are going through and identifying all the data sets that are needed to represent this full breadth of actions and objectives in the plan. We're also identifying the evidence that links actions to objectives. So where is the evidence that undertaking these things will deliver, water and carbon benefits? And then the next step after that's going to be quite a lot of work. That'll happen over the next 2 or 3 weeks. Or in fairness, they've already done a large amount of their work. It'll be drawing what they've already compiled to this list will happen now. The other thing we'll be doing is thinking about the targets. So ultimately, we're going to have to set targets for how much should these things happen across the area to deliver these outcomes. How much wetlands is enough? How much do we have to restore, establish, and conserve existing wetlands? And again, this is very much about a social process. So the next step will be sharing with you how you can input on these targets, how you can contribute to setting these targets. I can't tell you too much more than that because I'm not entirely sure myself just at this stage. It's very much, what we're doing is not trying to show you a finished product. What we're trying to do is take you on the journey that we're going on with you through this planning exercise. And part of the thing that makes this both exciting and also equally terrifying is that we don't really know quite what we're going to get until you tell us. So like I said, we've had to adapt the methods to the fact that we thought we'd get a good response, but this has been phenomenal. 449 actions and an equal number of objectives is just great, to be honest. I also can see from one of the questions from John Hiskett about the Norfolk Wildlife Trust and their strategy. And I have a slight confession to make, which is that I had spoken to them before and said I would go through the Norfolk and Suffolk Natural Capital Infants Compendium and draw out the actions and objectives from that. And I'm realizing now that slipped through the net just before the Christmas rush. So I'm really sorry. I will go and do that tomorrow morning and send that to you for you to check and confirm, and then we'll include it in the plan. So my apologies on that one. It's been quite a run around getting all this all together. So we'll be doing the actions, we're doing the targets in the webinar on the 2nd of February, and then following pretty quickly from that will be the first version of the plan, and that will come out probably the end of February, and then there will be a long, then there'll be a period for people to kind of consider this and respond to it and give us feedback in a wide range of different ways, and I think in many ways that will make this conversation a lot clearer. Once people can actually see a plan, they can actually print out a map that indicates where the priority areas are for these different zones. I think that will then make it much easier for people to identify what they do and don't like about this and how they'd like to see it improved. Fantastic. Is that anything else you'd like to add, Rob? I think we've come to the end of the questions. I think you might have to allow them to unmute. There we go.
Just using the power of multiple objectives to WhatsApp you, Nancy, to say to unmute me. It's worth answering. So two just final things I've just spotted in the questions. I guess great to see Archie offering up some potential further actions. Just to be really clear, Sam, just with the audience. So let's say somebody in the audience either hasn't sent in the submission or today they've had a penny drop moment and they wish to submit some more actions to you. What is your message, Sam? Is it just hold off for now and let this processing, or are you what should people do?
Send them in. I mean, people can send in, revise, edit, in any way, change their submissions at any stage. If something occurs to you and you get excited, send it in. You can go onto the form, and I mean, look, it's definitely easier if we get like a consolidated thing. But if you get excited and go onto the form, you can fill something in and submit it in like 2 minutes time. So it might be that you have a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, and you suddenly something clocks, like you say, a penny drops. Just send it in. We'd rather have more things and then kind of process it and deal with it in a slightly longer, more thorough way than have people not send things because they forget or other aspects of our busy lives take over. And I mean, you'll be able to see everything that's on there on the submission list already, because I'll be off the website. But if something's been submitted that if you feel like your action or objective has already been submitted, you should still submit yours, because what it does is help us build up the evidence base for this. It helps us build up the kind of the democratic accountability. If 29 different stakeholders all say they want to restore wetlands, well, that allows us to be really kind of confident in saying this is clearly of regional significance, and we have the evidence to back that up. So the more the better. There's literally no upper limit to how much feedback we would like to get.
Brilliant. Just a quick question, great question from for Wendy Blythe, just seeking clarification over the funding of this project as the biggest natural capital project. So this is being over half of the funding for the work that Sam's doing is coming from WRE, from our technical program. So we have a technical program to deliver the regional planning process, and this is informing our environmental destination piece. So this is for WRE. This is informing our environmental destination and the regions, answering the question in terms of what is the region's environmental ambition. So we're funding half of this, and the other half, or just under half, is then coming from WWF and the Coca-Cola Foundation, and they are interested in the reason the Coca-Cola, and this is being funded through their Replenish program. So this is their kind of national, their international program about restoration of fresh waters. So it's beyond chalk streams. It certainly goes beyond chalk stream landscapes, and they're very interested in this at scale. This is the first time this has been done at this scale. So as a piece of kind of international learning for WWF and the Coca-Cola Foundation, they're interested in the scale. So it's co-funded. It's kind of pretty much 50-50 across the both. So there we are. And just final comment from Wendy in terms of Cambridge City Centre green spaces. Would you like to hear about this?
Yes, please.
For him. Yes, please, Wendy. True. Thank you.
Well, yes, and I also know that Wendy has mentioned some of the questions before, the importance of the cultural heritage of these things. And I really would like more of that. I think that if people want things because they feel like it's part of the cultural heritage, the look and feel of a place, its sense of history, great. That stuff's really important. That matters to people, so please submit it. Yeah, it's fantastic.
I guess just in the 30 seconds left, Sam, just the feedback from Andrea Kelly at the Broads Authority in terms of the species actions. Have you got many species actions that have been submitted, and how are you going to deal with those? Great final question to end on.
Yes, this is a really important one, and I think probably at the regional level, the best way to do it is to deal with the habitats that would enable species to thrive. The communities within which the species exist, plan for those, and then deal with the species either through alternate, so field water voles, for example, might have own specific action plans around those, or through local plans. So often at the local level, you can start to manage things much more actively. The other thing that we'll probably do, although I can't make any promises, is use the species data to verify the results. So if we run the analysis and identify that actually there are some critical areas for critical species that have been left out as priorities, well, clearly that indicates we've made something wrong, made a mistake there, and we actually need to correct that. And then the other additional way that we use that data is where there are, like I said, potentially there might be stopover spots for migratory species that might not otherwise look very exciting, but for 1 month a year they're critical to geese. Great. Well, we'll identify those and kind of lock them in basically and go, look, these are important for reasons that you can't necessarily see in the data, but we know they're critical, so we'll include them as priorities.
Excellent.
Fantastic. Well, as always, this will be up online. There's a little questionnaire to fill in afterwards just to make sure that we're being clear and we're communicating effectively. So please fill that in. And yeah, I'm sure you're completely sick of asking you to send in submissions, but please do. Have a lovely day, and I will see you all in a month's time, or not a month's time, 3 weeks time, I think it is.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much, guys. Goodbye.